Previously, we looked at the 1930s Rhodesian Land Apportionment Act and how it all led to the settlers occupying a majority of the fertile land, leaving the black population in rural reserves which were made up of unfertile land. These factors resulted in a steady decline in the rural areas and the productive activities of peasantry. The result was their inability to provide subsistence. Africans were compelled to seek contract labor on European farms where they received token wages, hardly enough to keep body and soul together. Others were forced out of the rural areas into the urban areas where the social and economic conditions were brutalized. These new urban dwellers become the backbone of the growing Rhodesian industry. Also during this early period of black urbanization, that Zimbabwe experiences an early wave of Western influenced artists. Some of the earliest African artists to adopt Western culture into their music were the Omaskanda. Is often described as a neo-traditional style of music. The tradition has incorporated a number of Western and global instruments, as well as a number of traditional instruments, and is most famously linked to the guitar. The early Bulawayo guitarist referred to as Omaskanda had a distinctive country Western influence, modeled after the singing cowboy in American films of the time. And early performers of Maskanda looked like this. Academics specializing on the subject have also noted American blues music as a musical influence. Early Maskanda performer Jacob Mangu was quoted saying of how they heard on radio of how blacks in the United States were performing blues. He also states that many of the Zimbabwean musicians began their careers by imitating blues musicians in order to adapt their style. Blues is not the only American sound that has an influence on Zimbabwe's early black urban population.
Tonight we have the Hot Shots, and they come in their first number, Zuze. Pick it up, my boy.
Jazz music was popular in Zimbabwe in the 1950s and 60s. Zimbabwe had its own particular township jazz, a sound modeled of the South African kwela. Also during this period of jazz explosion that Dorothy Masobu, an artist we mentioned in an earlier episode, made her name. This jazz period would also inspire the Afro jazz sound, whose greatest exponent, Oliver Mtukudzi, another artist we mentioned in an earlier episode, go on to become one of Zimbabwe's greatest musical exports. The jazz movement was so strong that the great jazz legend Louis Armstrong toured Zimbabwe in the late 1950s. Louis Armstrong was so impressed and influenced by township jazz that he recorded his own version of Skoikani. The Zimbabwean jazz musicians of the 1950s also left their mark on the jazz industry at an international level with the success of August Musarura's Skoikani. The 50s and 60s also saw the show Music Time.
We just played Mariarida. Our next number is Ziza Bakanaka.
Hello and welcome to the Cool For Show. We just had a spooky call. Now listen to Zulu number saying Zula.
Production that was produced and distributed by the Central African Film Unit. Explaining the Central African Film Unit is a whole video in itself. But this quick summary from their website describes the Central African Film Unit as being an interterritorial film unit primarily intended to produce and distribute instructional films to African audiences. Southern Rhodesia would contribute 50% of the unit's operating costs, Southern Rhodesia being Zimbabwe. The remaining funds derived from the Colonial Development and Welfare Funds on behalf of Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland. Now back to the late 90s and the early 2000s, and you start to see a pattern. Just like the music from the 1930s, 40s and 50s, urban grooves had a strong influence from American culture. Also, what makes urban grooves such an interesting case study, it also comes about with the land issue in the backdrop.